So today is Friday, March 8th. It's International Women's Day. Okay. And so I would like to congratulate all the women out there. And I hope that everybody that is enjoying International Women's Day celebrates the day appropriately with a commitment to work-life balance issues. And so I want to talk about that. Um, the forecasting and policy analysis system Mark II, we think, has eliminated a lot of the rigidities, the bias um, against women. Um, there is not a lot of women in the forecast that are in charge of managing the forecasting and policy analysis system in central banks, with one exception. Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and so on. Now it's interesting to ask why that might be the case. One reason is that the forecasting and policy analysis system Mark One had some folly in it, the folly of baselines and local approximations, and those required very intense meetings where effectively people were arguing about things that you might consider to be folly. And of course, with childcare responsibilities, those kinds of organizations that ran FPAS Mark One, that's not just biased against women, it's biased against people that have important childcare responsibilities, for example. Okay, so meetings that lasted way too long, talking about things that people shouldn't be wasting their time talking about. Under FPAS Mark II, we've we've abandoned the whole notion of baseline projections, and the reason for that is that it's folly. It's a bunch of processes where under FS Mark One, typically you had a bunch of staff focused on trying to understand where the economy is, and of course that might be organized in various ways, but I remember when I first joined the Bank of Canada, I was a consumption specialist. Okay. And then you had the investment specialist and the inflation specialist and the labor market specialist and so on. And so a big problem with that approach to doing things is, first of all, uh, um, what is the information set that all these people are using? Are they all making the same assumptions? So it gives rise to horrendous coordination problems where you're trying to get all this information from these various people, and you're telling them that they're looking for the most likely scenario. But what are the chances that that everybody has the same information set in their mind, that there's macroeconomic consistency in this process, and so on? And then of course you up the game and start engaging policymakers and start playing the game that you're producing this most likely scenario. And then you bring technical things like technical modeling exercises that are designed to measure the most likely forecast and so on. And so obviously, if it doesn't make any sense to even think about measuring the most likely scenario, for reasons, for example, that Charles Goodhart has mentioned that, and other people have mentioned during our seminar series that, okay, so there's this folly in that stuff. And the problem is that, unfortunately, what that's meant is kind of last man standing. Um, uh, in other words, who can outlast everybody else, basically to squeeze their kind of views into the most likely forecast. So we've abandoned that stuff. We think in terms uh, of different scenarios, like case A, case B scenarios. Case A are scenarios where interest rates have to be higher than what's priced in financial markets. So inflationary pressures are higher and so on. When you do this, it increases efficiency massively because you don't waste your time trying to come up with the most likely scenario. Now, just think about how nonsensical it is. Let's suppose that you're playing that game, and a day before you release your monetary policy report or your press statement to people saying that it's the most likely scenario. What if something happened just before? And are you going to be able to credibly tell people that this truly is the most likely scenario? So eliminating the folly in baselines and local approximations and so on means that we focus much more on teaching people economics and focusing on important issues and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We also provide a lot more training to make sure that everybody that enters the production system for FS Mark II has had sufficient training. In fact, it only takes a six-person team to do FS Mark II, and that includes everything: the current analysis, the projections, writing the monetary policy report. All those things are done by a six-person team that has been trained. When you have two six-person teams, it means that you only have to do the quarterly projection exercise twice. And what does that mean? Well, in the construction of the quarterly projection exercise, which we're just in the process of completing at the Central Bank of Armenia, it means that you have a 28-day cycle where everybody knows in advance that there is one weekend that you have to work. But the difference between this system and the FS Mark one system is there's much less overtime because you've taken a lot of this inefficiency out of the system in terms of this baseline projection. So what you put in front of the policymakers for decision day, which is truly a decision day, is a case A and case B scenario, as well as a taxonomy of all the possible different risks, so that the policymakers can have the richest discussion that they can have, and then make a decision and communicate monetary policy, the rationale for setting the policy rate, as well as the rationale for providing what we describe as scenarios-based forward guidance. So this is a combination of quantitative forward guidance, which are things like macroeconomic scenarios, including case A and case B, and qualitative forward guidance, which is after you've made the decision of what the policy rate is, you then express whether or not you think the types of case A scenarios that you've discussed with your fellow colleagues and are publishing the monetary policy report, whether or not they're more likely than the case B scenarios. And this is a way to gently nudge market interest rates up or down. And of course, how strongly are you going to nudge, or is it going to be a gentle nudge, and so on. So this offers what we think is the most efficient way of thinking about monetary policy, and obviously communicating monetary policy in a way that you're thinking about it. Now the question is, what will the role of women and men be in this? And the answer is we don't know, but we do know that by eliminating the folly in local approximations and these baselines, that it is going to open up the possibility of massively improving work-life balance issues, and to the extent that that obviously women just for the consideration of, for example, childcare responsibilities, but also men that have those responsibilities, they will be able to perform quite well under a pass Mark II framework, which would have been very difficult, maybe almost impossible, especially when you have two people, a man and a woman working in a household. It'd be virtually impossible for one of or both of them to work in this kind of system. Whereas under FPAS Mark II, we have we have examples where uh, we have both women and men that are working under this system. So how do we do this? Well, we designed everything from scratch, where work-life balance issues was one consideration. Now, that was it for International um, uh, Women's Day. And now what I'm going to do is actually talk about some research on consumption functions that students of the Global Forecasting School are doing. Now, uh, one of the things that we do, we obviously, all the students have to cover the United States up to level zero point 0.6. And so that means that they have to write a version of the not Teal book, which is basically a version of applying FPAS Mark II to the United States. We use the United States as a laboratory because it has incredibly rich data sources. And so we like to train the economists, a country that has very rich data sources before we then get them to apply the ideas of FPAS Mark II to other countries. So, for example, the euro area or the ECB, smaller open economies like the Czech National Bank or the Bank of Canada or the Reserve Bank in New Zealand. So all of our students are now following one of these countries to get zero point 0.8 and 1.0, so level one. So they have to do this before they actually enter any of our production systems. So focus on the US initially, up to 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. And that involves understanding all the analytical tools like the endogenous uh, monetary policy credibility model that we use for our quarterly projection exercise. It means using all of our monthly tools. It means actually understanding all the important time series data uh, in the United States, understanding the concepts of the data, understanding what the basic stylized facts are, and so on. Also means that they have to pass advanced macro policy modeling 1 and 2. So advanced macro modeling 1 is FPAS Mark II, endogenous policy credibility. AMPM2 is understanding the ideas of endogenous money creation, understanding fiscal policy, and how to think about fiscal policy in a much more structured way. We use the global integrated monetary fiscal model and teach them about how to think about fiscal multipliers and fiscal rules and fiscal sustainability and all those issues. Now, today, what we're going to talk about is one of the students' uh, recent results. Her name is Miriam. She's at the National Bank of Georgia, and she's been estimating some consumption functions. She's been estimating consumption functions for quite some time now. So this is how to update them uh, given the recent events of COVID. So what's happened? So the very first thing that we're going to do is to estimate standard consumption function that includes basically the three key variables are real personal consumption expenditures. um, we're going to use a variable instead of real disposable income. We have a measure of real permanent disposable income, which you can just think of as an estimate of the trend. So we have a stochastic process uh, for many variables for estimating the trends. And so this is basically just taking a lot of the transitory high frequency fluctuations out of real disposable income. And this is going to be the very important scale variable in the consumption regression. In addition to that, we have a real net wealth variable. It's going to be very standard. So the Fed produces the household balance sheet, and it has featured very prominently in consumption functions for years. So far we have real disposable income and and this real net wealth variable. Okay, I'm going to take you through that real net wealth variable because it has increased massively during the period of COVID, and it has been the variable that has explained why consumption has been so much stronger than what people were expecting. So last year, people were expecting a recession, and what happened is that consumption, the U.S. Consumer, is held in there, and that part of the reason for that, probably the most important reason for that, is the fact that this household wealth has increased enormously. And of course, a measure of the real interest rate. In this case, in this little econometric work, we're going to be using the real 10-year bond rate from the index bond market. Now, our sample is going to go back to 2003 initially, but we're in the process of running everything back further to 1980. The reason is that our original econometric results went back to 2003, but some work at one of the regional feds has pushed this real interest rate measure back to 1980. So we're actually in the process of updating the results and showing how the elasticities have changed over time, particularly with respect to the wealth variable, okay, which theoretically should be driven by movements in demographics, basically as the composition of households changes and gets older over time. That's going to increase the elasticity or the amount that they consume in aggregate out of this wealth variable. Now let's look at the regression from 2003 to 2019. So the first parameter is going to be a lag of consumption, okay, which we can see here is 0.48. The next variable is going to be this real personal disposable income variable, but again, it's going to be the a permanent component, or think of it as the trend in that variable. And you see the elasticity is like 0.34. Okay, so this is going to be a very important variable. Real income drives consumption. And in our case, the permanent component of real disposable income is a very important determinant of aggregate consumption. The next variable is lagged real wealth. Okay, this variable that we were looking at, and see it has an elasticity of 0.1. Okay, and so these two variables are going to be estimated based on the data. We're not going to estimate the parameter on the real interest rate term because obviously it's over a sample where monetary policy has been responding to shocks. And so obviously we can't estimate the effects of interest rates over that sample very reliably because we don't have any periods like the early 1980s when the Fed was raising interest rates to create a recession, to in other words, to make consumption and economic activity to decline and so on. So in the extended results that we're working on, where we actually are going to construct measures of human wealth and so on, we'll be getting into that. But for the purpose of this exercise, we just assume an elasticity for the real interest rate of 0.25, or more precisely minus 0.25. That would be in line with the types of estimates that you would get from a structural interpretation of the consumption function. Okay, so that is imposed in the analysis again because we're using the short sample and we wanted to have that effect captured, that real interest rate effect captured using standard types of elasticities. Okay, so the first thing is, does the consumption function fit? And the answer is, of course, it's the consumption function. You can see the standard error of the residual. So we're measuring consumption as 100 times the natural log. And so the residual standard error is only 0.3 percentage points. So this equation fits. You might say it's the best fitting relationship in the US macro time series, aside from maybe one. You might say Okun's law maybe fits a little bit better. So Okun's law is the relationship between the unemployment rate and growth. And so the unemployment rate basically responds slowly. Unemployment is pretty smooth, but responds well if aggregate demand changes in the goods market. Unemployment is affected contemporaneously, but then there's a bit of a lag, and so that relationship might be a little bit tighter than this one. Now, why does it fit so well? So we're looking at the fitted value, the regression, and the actual variable, the log or real consumption, as the red line. So the dashed line is the fitted value. Below, you'll see the residuals. And so what we've done is plotted 2 times the standard error, the regression. Again, I told you it was like 0.3. So 2 standard errors is 0.6. And so these are the actual residuals, or the difference between the actual and the fitted regression. What do you see? Well, you can see that we got some negative residuals back during the global financial crisis, and we've had some negative residuals during the just before COVID, but they're tiny, like they're very tiny. Now the question is, why? Why does this equation fit so well? And the answer is endogenous money creation is why it fits so well. Because when you have a modern financial system giving credit to households, whatever credit it is that they want to finance the purchases that they're buying, this consumption, and also giving whatever credit is required to finance the income. In other words, the production of goods and services to businesses to produce those goods and services and to generate income to pay households. When the economy, the modern financial system is doing its job, everybody is getting enough credit to support that income and to support that consumption, as well as the level of asset prices. Okay, so when you think of the economy, people need money, or people need purchasing power to support uh, this consumption and these income levels, as well as the value of assets uh, that are being purchased and sold in financial markets. And so the reason, endogenous money creation just means that these quantities are going to be tightly connected as they are in the real world. Now, so what happened? Well, COVID happened, and so what we're going to do here is just show you something that should be completely obvious. If you update the data uh, to include the last quarter, which is up to 2023 Q4, obviously during COVID, we had lockdowns where consumption was constrained. People weren't allowed to consume their consumption basket. And of course, we had these big transfers from the government. And so you have income and consumption moving in different directions. So that's going to distort the parameter values. And so you can see that, the elasticity on the lag increased. That makes sense because that's usually an indication of misspecification error that the coefficient of the lag is the residuals are going to get serially correlated, and some of that will be trying to be picked up at the lag. But you can also look at the scale variable on this real permanent income variable. It was, remember, 0.34, and it's fallen to 0.14. So a big collapse. Why? Well, because disposable income is going up in some quarters and consumption is really low because of the lockdown. Also, the elasticity on the real wealth variable falls a little bit. And you see the residual standard error obviously is really, really big. It was, remember, 0.3 before, and now it's got all the way up to 1.3. This is just looking at the actual and the fitted value, and see that it all falls apart. Okay, now the question that Miriam addressed. So we had two control variables to deal with COVID that we were using in real time. One was basically the Google retail and recreational mobility, okay, which was very useful during COVID in terms of picking up lockdown effects on consumption and so on. And we had another variable to pick up precautionary saving, which basically Google Trends using the word unemployment. So people, typing the word unemployment in Google, that actually ended up creating a measure of unemployment uncertainty that was really helpful for understanding what was going on. So what happened? So COVID happened, and COVID happened in the first quarter of 2020. Okay, and so the question that Miriam wanted to address is to add time dummies for every quarter for 2020, 2021, and 2022. Okay. And the idea is that we had lockdowns, and then the economy, and it would get rid of the lockdowns, and of course the COVID would come back, and of course there's all kinds of problems with uh, consuming what you wanted to consume, and there were problems with all kinds of bottlenecks in certain sectors, like people couldn't get cars, and um, people couldn't get anything that virtually was shipped in a container for a long time, and prices were rising. So it was a tremendous period. So what Miriam has done here is to ask, let's suppose that um, that we were to use the elasticities before COVID, okay, and effectively just use dummies to dummy out every quarter in 2020, 2021, and 2022. So this is sort of assuming that that COVID is behind us. And what if we were to use basically the same scale variables on this real disposable income, this permanent real disposable income variable, the RPI variable, and this wealth variable. And so how do you do that? Well, you just dummy out, like create quarterly dummies for 2020, 2021, and 2022. So that's 12 quarters where basically the dummy zero up to that quarter, and then it turns on as equal to one, and then goes back to zero. So basically, the regression can fit perfectly in that quarter. So it will have zero residual error. And then we say, okay, now starting in 2023, how well does this regression work? And the answer is quite interesting. So these are all the time dummies. Interesting. You still see that the Google unemployment variable. You can still get an estimate of what that is. So this is the precautionary saving effect, as well as this retail and recreational mobility thing. But the dummies kind of knock it out. Now you look at the residuals, and again, 0.3. The scale elasticities obviously are mainly going to be determined by the data up before COVID. Okay, but obviously in 2023, those observations will also be included, but that's not going to, that's not going. That's only four observations out of the whole sample, so that's not going to change anything. So the elasticities on the lag still 0.5. On the real disposable income variable, again, it's the permanent component is 0.34. So that's the same thing as we had before. On the real wealth variable, 0.1. Okay, now so what happens? So this is what happens. So as you can see, the residuals for 2023 were, I would say even smaller than the historical sample, meaning that the higher consumption that we observed in 2023 is explained basically by these real disposable income and this real wealth variables, as well as the increase in real interest rates. So what does this mean? So what is the interpretation of this of these results? Well, one interpretation is that why do we observe an elasticity of about 0.1 with respect to this real wealth variable? And the answer is because there's a certain proportion of the population that is consuming, principally retired people, and more people are getting retired. So I would just want to go through a little bit about wealth and talk about it, because it's a very important variable that the Global Forecasting School students have to follow. Before I do that, just let me pull up the personal saving rate. Okay, now this is really important because how saving is measured in the national accounts does not include capital gains. Okay, so this wealth variable is going to include the increase in property prices that we've observed during COVID, which have been about over 50%. And of course, there's been a massive, humongous increase in equity prices. And so if one thinks of a better theoretical notion of saving as being the change in people's wealth, so that theoretically is what we should be thinking about when we think of saving. this kind of saving rate in the national accounts does not capture increases in asset values. Now, why should we care about that? Well, the reason we should care about that is that the increase in assets has been truly humongous. Okay, humongous is the only word I can think about it. Okay, so what happened? So at the end of 2019, we can see that the net wealth of the household sector was $110 trillion dollars. Okay. And so what happened? Well, COVID happened, and that resulted in lockdowns and so on. And everybody knew that um, there was going to have to be lockdowns to control this infectious disease. Um, and so when did that happen? Well, a very important time uh, in dating, in my mind, was when the joint China World Health Organization mission got back from China and basically reported what they were doing to contain COVID. And the rest of the world saw that it was going to be virtually impossible to do what the Chinese were doing to contain it. And as a result of that, equity prices fell massively. What did that mean? Well, meant that that household wealth fell from this $110 trillion down to about $104 trillion. So it fell by about $6 trillion. Now, what's interesting here is what happened afterwards. The highly stimulatory policies. Remember, we lost output because of COVID, but the but asset prices are the expected discounted value of output in the future. And because of low real interest rates, that resulted in an enormous increase in household wealth. Now, how much? Well, from 104 trillion at the end of 2020 to you can see it reached a peak at about 144 trillion in the first quarter of 2022. And then we got a bit of a correction. So so again, it went from 104 trillion at the end of 2020 up to 144 trillion. So about a $40 trillion increase. And then there was a bit of a correction going through 2022. And now it's right back up 147 trillion. So 147 trillion at the end of 2023, 104 trillion at the end of 2020, quarter one. So there's been a 43 trillion, 147 minus 104. So a 43 trillion dollar increase in the measure of household wealth. How big is that? 2019, so 2019, sorry, 2019 GDP in the United States was $21 trillion. So household wealth has increased by like over twice annual GDP. Like it's truly it's a staggering number. Now, so there's probably a big bubble, but as I showed you in my regression results, people are consuming out of that wealth, and that is potentially very, very dangerous uh, uh, because basically, if that were to rotate from high levels of consumption to high levels of debt, then we would have the extremely dangerous cocktail of an excessive credit expansion and asset price bubble. And is what what the best leading indicator of a financial crisis is. So don't uh, go out and sell your equities tomorrow, but you certainly want to think about maybe uh, 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 reducing some risk to equity markets right now because they seem to be uh, the values seem to be completely over. You know, they're way too high by humongous amount. Now, you look at the S&P today or on Friday or yesterday, it was 51.53. These numbers do not include the first quarter because the first quarter is not over. It's only March 8th. But if the S&P were to close at what the value was yesterday, which was 51.53, at the end of December, it was 47.69. So it's risen 8% since the end of the first quarter. So that would be another humongous increase in household wealth and could be one thing that could support consumption not only in the first quarter but obviously for some period of time. So I think these results are really interesting. Miriam is in the process of drafting up a working paper that will discuss them, as well as extending uh, the model to include a framework that measures household wealth, so that we can study how some of these elasticities on particularly the wealth variable will change over time as people become older and start obviously there'll be a larger proportion of the population that is consuming out of this wealth. So this elasticity on wealth should be increasing over time. So that's one of the areas of research that they're currently investigating. So on that note, happy International Women's Day, and I hope that you enjoyed this very brief presentation about the U.S. household balance sheet and the importance of it in terms of thinking about what sustainable